Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of the most gloriously embarrassing chapters in the history of American sports. The 1994 FIFA World Cup. The first and only time the United States ever hosted the most watched sporting event on the planet. A tournament that brought in billions of dollars, sold out stadiums that weren't built for soccer, and somehow convinced an entire country to briefly care about a sport it had spent decades ignoring. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. A huge thank you to everyone who suggested this one. You know who you are, and honestly, your taste in obscure financial disasters is impeccable. It really does mean everything when you drop a comment or a topic idea. You're basically the editorial team at this point. And for those of you who prefer to drift off on the go, the channel is now on Spotify, links in the description. Now dim those lights, pull that blanket up, turn on a fan, and get genuinely comfortable, because this is going to take a while. Before we begin, let's just sit with a few questions, shall we? Have you ever wondered what happens when a country that doesn't understand a sport agrees to host its World Championship? Did American cities actually think a 2-month soccer tournament was going to make them rich? What did they spend the money on? Where did it go? Did anyone go to jail? Did anyone even apologize? Did the players know that half their host cities had never seen a live soccer match? And what exactly does it feel like to build a gleaming new stadium, throw the world's biggest party inside it, and then wake up the next morning with an invoice the size of a small nation's GDP and absolutely no plan for what comes next? Congratulations. It's June 1994. The World Cup has just arrived in America, and somewhere a city comptroller is staring at a spreadsheet with the 1,000-yard look of a man who has just realized what he agreed to. Let's start at the very beginning, which in this case is 1988, the year FIFA handed the United States the 1994 World Cup bid, and roughly 80% of the country responded by asking what FIFA was. The announcement was made in Zurich with great ceremony and international fanfare. While back in America most of the population was watching football, the other kind, the one with helmets and ads for truck insurance every 3 minutes, soccer in the United States of 1988 was not nothing, but it was close. It was the sport your kid played on Saturday mornings before the real game, the one nobody televised. And yet, somehow, the country had just agreed to host the biggest sporting event on Earth. The decision made perfect sense on paper. America had the stadiums, the infrastructure, the hotels, the highways, and the organisational muscle. What it did not have, at any level, was a professional soccer league, a national team anyone had heard of, or a population that could tell you what a 0-0 draw meant. None of this seemed to concern FIFA very much. They handed over the keys, smiled broadly for the cameras, and flew home. The reckoning, as it always does, came later. The bid itself had been assembled by a group of American soccer administrators who were by any measure visionaries, people who genuinely believed that hosting the World Cup could transform soccer's status in the United States permanently. Alan Rothenberg, a Los Angeles sports lawyer who had become the tournament's chief executive, was among them. So was Werner Fricker, the president of the US Soccer Federation at the time the bid was submitted. These men had watched the sport struggle for decades in America. They had seen the North American Soccer League collapse in the early 1980s, leaving behind a generation of fans and a fading memory of packed stadiums. They understood that the only way to build something permanent was to do something dramatic first. Hosting the World Cup was the most dramatic thing available, so they went after it. The rival bids came from Morocco, Brazil, and Chile. Morocco had submitted ambitious proposals before and had the passionate support of African nations within FIFA. Brazil had a claim rooted in pure soccer credibility, the most successful national team in the history of the sport, a country where soccer was not a leisure activity but something closer to a civic religion. Chile had regional support and a reasonable infrastructure case. America had something different: money, organizational capacity, and the implicit promise of an enormous new television market that FIFA had been eyeing for years. The United States was the largest economy on Earth, with a sports entertainment industry that dwarfed anything elsewhere. Bringing the World Cup to America meant potentially bringing it to 100 million living rooms that had never watched it before. FIFA voted accordingly. Morocco got the most sympathy. America got the bid. The reaction inside the American sports establishment was polite bewilderment. This was 1988. The NFL was in its imperial phase. The NBA was producing Magic Johnson and Larry Bird. Baseball was still processing the implications of free agency. Nobody in American sports media was sitting around wondering when soccer would arrive. Sports editors at major newspapers had to be reminded what the World Cup was. Television executives ran the numbers on soccer viewership, saw figures so small they were essentially rounding errors, and began quietly calculating how to present the tournament as something other than what it was. The organising committee, to its credit, did not flinch. It set up offices, hired staff, began the long process of convincing a country that had spent decades ignoring a sport that it was about to host the greatest version of that sport the world had ever seen. They had 6 years to make it work. 6 years, it turned out, was barely enough. Not because the organisation was incompetent, it wasn't, but because the scope of what had been agreed to only revealed itself gradually. The way a very large bill looks manageable until you unfold it completely and realise it has additional pages. 9 American cities were selected as host venues for the 1994 World Cup: New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Dallas, Chicago, Boston, Detroit, Orlando, and Washington, D.C. Each of them looked at the bid documents, saw words like international prestige, global exposure, and economic windfall, and signed on the dotted line with the cheerful confidence of someone who has never actually read a contract. What they agreed to, in practice, was a fairly staggering list of obligations. Host cities were required to renovate or retrofit existing stadiums to meet FIFA's specifications, install temporary seating to expand capacity, build new training facilities, set up media centres, upgrade security infrastructure, provide transportation logistics, and cover a significant portion of the costs out of their own budgets. In exchange, they would receive a share of the revenue, a share that, as several cities would eventually discover, was considerably smaller than the glossy brochures had suggested. The cities did not fully understand this yet. They were still in the honeymoon phase, already printing promotional materials and booking catering companies, blissfully unaware of exactly how much it cost to host the world. The selection process had been competitive. Dozens of American cities initially expressed interest in hosting, drawn by the same economic projections and prestige arguments that would later prove complicated. The field was narrowed through a series of evaluations by the organising committee and FIFA, assessing stadium capacity, hotel room availability, transportation infrastructure, and the general readiness of local government to absorb the administrative demands of a major international event. Cities hired consultants, prepared pitch documents, and sent delegations to present their cases. It was, in the way of all municipal competitions for major events, a performance, cities presenting the most optimistic possible version of themselves to a panel of evaluators who were largely deciding on the basis of logistics rather than charm. The 9 that were chosen represented a reasonable geographic spread and included the country's largest media markets. New York and Los Angeles were obvious anchors. Chicago, Dallas, and Washington gave the tournament a national footprint. Boston and San Francisco added cultural credibility. Detroit and Orlando filled out the schedule with venues large enough to handle the required capacities. Each city signed a host city agreement that ran to dozens of pages and spelled out, in considerable detail, exactly what they were responsible for providing. There is a reasonable argument that people should have read those pages more carefully. There is an equally reasonable argument that even the people who did read them carefully did not fully anticipate how the cost would escalate once the actual work began. The problem with hosting a FIFA World Cup, as opposed to most other major events, is that FIFA's requirements do not flex to meet local conditions. They are what they are. If the specification says the stadium needs to hold a minimum of 60,000 spectators, it needs to hold 60,000 spectators. If it says the grass must be natural turf maintained to specific density and firmness standards, that is what must be delivered. If it says the media centre must have a certain number of accredited workstations with dedicated communications lines, those workstations appear and someone pays for them. The someone paying for them, in most cases, was the host city. Each city had negotiated slightly different terms, but the underlying dynamic was consistent. FIFA set the standard, the city met it, and the meeting of it cost money. Local politicians who had championed the bids found themselves in the familiar position of officials who have made a popular announcement and must now manage the unpopular consequences of it. Budget hearings became uncomfortable. Questions about cost overruns required answers that were technically accurate, but often strategically incomplete. The cities had said yes, they were committed. There was nothing to do but keep going, keep spending, and keep telling their residents that the economic windfall was just around the corner. Here is something FIFA perhaps should have mentioned before handing America the tournament. The United States did not own a single purpose-built soccer stadium, not one. The venues selected to host World Cup matches were, without exception, enormous American football stadiums, places designed for a sport played on a 100-yard rectangular field, with rows of seats optimized for watching men in helmets collide with each other at high speed. Soccer is played on a larger field. The pitch dimensions are different. The optimal viewing angles are different. The entire spatial logic of the sport is different. So what did the organising committee do? They improvised. Temporary grass fields were laid over artificial turf. Seating configurations were adjusted. In some cases, sections of the stands were literally blocked off because the sight lines were so poor that FIFA deemed them unfit for human use. At Giants Stadium in New Jersey, the grass surface was installed over the Meadowlands' artificial turf and promptly began dying in the June heat, requiring emergency watering schedules and around-the-clock maintenance crews to keep it from turning into a large, expensive patch of brown. It was, in the most American way imaginable, a spectacular jury rig, and it mostly worked. But mostly worked came with a bill attached. The fundamental incompatibility between American football stadium design and soccer was not a secret. It had been known from the moment the bid was assembled. American football fields are shorter than soccer pitches and oriented differently within their seating bowls. The end zones, the areas where the seats are typically densest and the sight lines theoretically worst, correspond roughly to the areas of a soccer field where the most critical action happens. The corners, the bylines, the goal mouths. A fan sitting in the end zone at an NFL stadium watching a football game has an acceptable if imperfect view. That same fan watching a soccer match in the same seat is essentially watching the action from a perpendicular angle to the direction of play, which ranges from suboptimal to genuinely baffling depending on how far around the curve they are sitting. FIFA's solution was categorical. Any seating section that fell below acceptable viewing standards was simply closed. This meant that several of the tournament's host stadiums had large sections of seats physically present, but not available for sale, wrapped in dark fabric or simply cordoned off, which did interesting things to the stadium atmosphere and also to the revenue projections. Selling 60,000 tickets sounds better than selling 45,000 tickets with 15,000 seats blocked, which is the actual arithmetic some venues were working with once FIFA had done its assessment. The grass installation challenges were the other dominant story. American football stadiums in 1994 used artificial surfaces almost universally. Field turf and similar products were cheaper to maintain, more durable under repeated heavy use, and better suited to the multi-purpose calendar of events that filled a major stadium schedule. Natural grass, which FIFA mandated absolutely, required a completely different approach. Groundskeeping crews who had spent careers maintaining artificial surfaces had to rapidly learn an entirely different skill set. Specialist contractors were brought in. The grass was grown in large modular sections off-site, transported to the stadiums and assembled like an enormous green puzzle over the existing artificial surface. Irrigation systems were installed underneath. Drainage had to be managed. The whole arrangement was delicate in a way that made stadium managers visibly anxious throughout the tournament. It mostly held together. The grass was imperfect in places and required constant attention throughout the 6 weeks of competition, but players were generally able to play on it without complaining more than professional athletes normally do about surfaces, which is to say they complained but not catastrophically. When the tournament ended, virtually every installation was removed, and the stadiums returned to their normal artificial surfaces within weeks. All that careful preparation, all those hours of specialist grass management, undone in a fortnight. The stadiums were exactly what they had always been, just temporarily, expensively, incongruously green. FIFA, the international governing body of soccer, is not an organisation known for its modesty. When FIFA comes to your city, it does not come quietly, hat in hand, grateful for the hospitality. It arrives with a 40-page list of requirements, a team of inspectors, and the serene confidence of a house guest who has decided your home isn't quite up to standard. For the 1994 World Cup, FIFA's demands included exclusive commercial zones around every stadium, meaning local businesses that had operated in those areas for decades were prohibited from operating during match days unless they were official sponsors. Actual signage had to be removed. Competing products had to disappear. The entire visual environment of several city blocks had to be sanitized to FIFA's specifications. Host cities also had to provide large quantities of complimentary tickets to FIFA officials, hospitality suites, transportation fleets, and dedicated communication infrastructure. All of this was, naturally, the host's problem to pay for. One city official, speaking anonymously to a reporter after the tournament, described the experience as being asked to throw a very expensive party for someone else's guests, in your own house, with your own money, and then being charged a cleaning fee at the end. The commercial exclusion zones were among the most contentious of FIFA's requirements. The principle behind them was straightforward from FIFA's perspective. Official sponsors had paid significant sums for the right to associate their brands with the tournament, and that association would be meaningless if competing brands were visible in the same environment. Coca-Cola did not want photographs of crowds entering a World Cup stadium to show Pepsi billboards in the background. Adidas did not want Nike signage appearing in matchday broadcasts. The logic was commercially coherent. The practical application of it was considerably more complicated. Small business owners near stadium sites found themselves receiving letters informing them that their regular signage had to be covered or removed on match days, and that their products, if those products competed with official sponsors, could not be sold within designated perimeters. A pizzeria that had operated on the same corner for 20 years was told it could not display its own name on the days when tens of thousands of hungry spectators were walking past. A convenience store selling a non-official soft drink was required to cover its displays. The compensation offered for these disruptions was minimal to non-existent. Several businesses reported that match days, which they had expected to be their most profitable of the year, turned out to be their most complicated, their most restricted, and in some cases their least financially rewarding. The hospitality demands were a separate category of extravagance. FIFA officials required suites, transportation, accommodation at specific hotels, and a level of service that reflected the organisation's understanding of its own importance. The cost of providing this hospitality was incorporated into the host city agreements, distributed across organising committee budgets, and ultimately borne by the overall tournament finances. The vehicles required to transport FIFA personnel between hotels and stadiums alone required a dedicated fleet, staff, and fuel budget. The catering requirements for official hospitality areas were documented in specifications that ran to multiple pages. None of this was optional, and none of it was free. What made FIFA's demands particularly pointed was the contrast between what was asked of host cities and what was returned to them. The cities provided the infrastructure, absorbed the costs, managed the disruptions to local business and daily life, and delivered the stadiums, services and support that made the tournament function. The revenues generated by that tournament, the ticket sales, the broadcasting rights, the sponsorship income, flowed primarily to FIFA and the organising committee, rather than to the cities themselves. It was not technically an unfair arrangement, in the sense that it was clearly specified in the agreements that had been signed, but it was the kind of arrangement that looks different at the end than it did at the beginning, and the cities, looking at their final accounts, found themselves reflecting on the difference between hosting a global event and benefiting from one. Every city that bid for the 1994 World Cup was presented with economic impact projections that read like a financial fantasy novel. Consultants hired by the organising committee produced reports estimating that each host city would see hundreds of millions of dollars in economic activity, hotel bookings, restaurant revenue, retail spending, international tourism, the whole gleaming cascade of money that supposedly falls from the sky whenever a major sporting event arrives in town. These projections were, to put it diplomatically, optimistic. They were based on multiplier models that had a long and distinguished history of overstating actual returns, particularly for events that lasted only a few weeks and drew visitors who were primarily interested in the stadiums and not much else. They assumed international tourists would stay longer, spend more, and explore more widely than they actually did. They did not fully account for the fact that many local residents, annoyed by the traffic and the crowds and the sudden unavailability of their usual parking spots, simply left town for the duration of the tournament, taking their spending with them. The projections were made in good faith. They were also almost entirely wrong. The methodology behind economic impact studies for major sporting events has been scrutinized by academic economists for decades, and the consensus is not flattering. The models tend to count every dollar spent by a tournament visitor as new economic activity without accounting for the substitution effect, the phenomenon whereby local residents who would otherwise have spent that money in the same city choose to go somewhere else to avoid the crowds and the inflated prices. A family from Ohio that would normally have visited Chicago in June decides to go to Michigan instead because they've heard Chicago is a nightmare during the World Cup. The money they would have spent in Chicago simply doesn't arrive. This effect, which is real and measurable, was not included in the projections presented to host city governments in the late 1980s. You can decide for yourself whether this omission was accidental. Hotel prices during the tournament were, in most host cities, extraordinary. Room rates doubled and tripled in the weeks around major matches. This looked like economic activity, and in a narrow sense it was. Hotel owners and their investors were doing very well. But it also meant that many visitors who might have extended their stays, who might have spent additional days exploring the cities around the matches they'd come to see, chose not to because they couldn't afford to. The tournament compressed spending into a narrow window, and at artificially elevated prices which satisfied the headline revenue numbers while suppressing the broader economic engagement the projections had assumed. Restaurants and retailers near stadiums had genuinely profitable days around matches. Further from the stadiums, the picture was more complicated. Cities reported that business in their downtown cores was, for some of those 6 weeks, actually below normal. The tournament had displaced their regular commercial activity without fully replacing it. Locals who would have been in those neighbourhoods had retreated. International visitors were moving in tight orbits between hotels and stadiums. The broad economic diffusion the models had projected, the image of international tourists wandering through neighbourhoods, visiting museums, buying things, happened in some cities and in some neighbourhoods, but not consistently and not at the scale that had been promised. The post-tournament accounting was done carefully in some cities and less carefully in others. The cities that did it carefully arrived at conclusions that were awkward to publicise. The cities that did it less carefully retained the option of citing the original projections indefinitely. Both choices were understandable. Neither was entirely honest. New York was, in theory, the crown jewel of the American World Cup. The final match, the biggest game in the sport's history, watched by 1 billion people worldwide, was scheduled for Giant Stadium in East Rutherford, New Jersey, which is technically not New York at all, a geographical distinction that New Yorkers found either amusing or insulting depending on their borough of origin. The stadium preparations were extensive and expensive. New Jersey poured money into infrastructure upgrades, transportation improvements, and stadium renovations. The grass field installation became a minor crisis of its own, requiring specially imported turf and a maintenance regime so intensive that stadium groundskeepers later described it as the most stressful weeks of their professional lives. The final itself, Brazil versus Italy, was the most watched sporting event in American television history up to that point, and it ended 0-0 after extra time, decided by a penalty shootout, which is exactly the kind of conclusion that confirmed every American sports fan's existing suspicion that soccer was specifically designed to avoid providing satisfying endings. New Jersey came away with the prestige of having hosted the final and a renovation bill that would take years to settle. The preparations for the final began long before the tournament. Giant Stadium was already one of the largest and most modern venues in American sports, but FIFA's requirements demanded modifications that the stadium had not been designed to accommodate. The seating configuration had to be adjusted. Temporary hospitality structures had to be erected. The media centre had to be built from essentially nothing, as the stadium's existing press facilities were oriented toward football coverage and did not meet the standards required for a global broadcast event watched by 1 billion viewers. The communications infrastructure alone, the cables, the satellite uplinks, the dedicated lines required for dozens of international broadcasters, was a major engineering project in its own right. The grass situation at Giant Stadium became something of a running story during the tournament. The Meadowlands environment, with its proximity to tidal wetlands and its particular combination of humidity and summer heat, was not ideal for the carefully managed natural turf surface that had been installed. Groundskeepers reported that the grass required more intensive maintenance than almost any other venue in the tournament. Sections that had looked pristine at the start of the group stage had developed visible wear patterns by the time the knockout rounds began. Emergency resodding was performed between matches. FIFA inspectors came, looked carefully, and issued formal assessments that were diplomatically worded but clearly communicating concern. The surface held together for the final. It was not, by the end, the surface that had been installed 6 weeks earlier. It was what happens to natural grass when you ask it to do things it wasn't designed for, in an environment it wasn't designed for, and then subject it to the footfall of the world's best soccer players for a month and a half. Roberto Baggio missed the final penalty in the shootout. Brazil became world champions for the 4th time. The stadium erupted. The images went around the world. New Jersey got its moment of global visibility, which it had paid for substantially. The renovation costs, the infrastructure upgrades, the ongoing maintenance bills from the tournament period, all of it was folded into budget cycles that played out over the following years with considerably less fanfare than the final itself. Los Angeles got the Rose Bowl, which is an actual genuinely beautiful stadium nestled in the hills of Pasadena, and which was, by the standards of the American 1994 experience, relatively well suited to the occasion. The city threw itself into the tournament with characteristic California enthusiasm, which is to say, a great many people who had never watched a soccer match in their lives suddenly acquired very strong opinions about it and began wearing replica jerseys. The Rose Bowl had hosted major events before and handled the logistics with reasonable competence. Los Angeles also benefited from its massive international population, particularly its large Latino communities, who treated the tournament not as a novelty but as the event it actually was, the most important thing happening on Earth for 4 weeks. Crowds for certain matches had an atmosphere unlike anything seen elsewhere in the tournament. The money flowed, the sun shone. The traffic was, by local standards, only moderately catastrophic. Los Angeles emerged from the World Cup as something of a success story, which made it somewhat anomalous in the larger narrative. The Rose Bowl's qualifications as a host venue were genuine. It had held 100,000 spectators for college football games and had hosted events on the scale of the Super Bowl. Its open bowl design, with the San Gabriel Mountains rising in the distance beyond the rim, provided sightlines that were better than most of the American football stadiums in the tournament. Not perfect for soccer, but acceptable in a way that didn't require large sections to be blocked off. The grass installation, while still requiring the same intensive management as everywhere else, had the advantage of Pasadena's relatively mild June climate, which was gentler on the turf than Dallas or Detroit. The overall venue experience was, by the consistent assessment of international visitors, one of the best in the tournament. The matches assigned to Los Angeles were also, by the luck of the tournament draw, among the most atmospheric. The presence of large Mexican, Brazilian, German, Italian, Romanian and Colombian communities in Southern California meant that many matches had something approaching genuine international fan sections, actual supporters from the countries playing, not just curious Americans who had bought tickets through corporate channels. The sound inside the Rose Bowl during the Mexico versus Republic of Ireland group stage match was described by multiple journalists as unlike anything they had witnessed in American sports. The city, in those moments, revealed something about itself that the projections and the budget documents couldn't capture. It was genuinely, organically, passionately engaged in a way that most of the country was not. The financial performance of Los Angeles was better than the national average, partly because of the venue's capacity, and partly because the city's existing international tourism infrastructure, the hotels, the restaurants, the transport networks, was already calibrated to handle visitors from everywhere in the world. Los Angeles did not need to build much of the hospitality capacity that other cities had to construct from scratch. It absorbed the tournament into its existing metabolism without the strains that smaller or less internationally connected cities experienced. This did not mean Los Angeles made money on the tournament in any straightforward sense. It meant the losses, where they existed, were smaller and easier to absorb. The legacy for Los Angeles was straightforward and genuine. Attendance at youth soccer programs in the Los Angeles Unified School District increased measurably in the years following the tournament. The Mexican national team's following in Southern California, already large, became institutional. The Rose Bowl's reputation as a host venue for major international events was confirmed. The city filed its post-tournament financial reports and went back to being Los Angeles, which is to say, it moved on with efficiency and paid the bills without making much of a fuss about it. somebody decided to hold World Cup matches in Dallas in June. Let us sit with that for a moment. Dallas in June is a city that has essentially declared war on the human body. The average high temperature sits somewhere in the mid to upper 90s Fahrenheit. The humidity is aggressive. The sun is not so much warm as it is personally hostile. The Cotton Bowl, the stadium selected for Dallas matches, had limited shade and a grass surface that the heat immediately began treating as a personal project. Players who had come from Europe, where summer temperatures are managed by a more reasonable arrangement between the climate and human biology, arrived in Dallas and immediately began reconsidering their career choices. Fans in the stands sat in direct sunlight for matches that kicked off at noon local time. A scheduling decision made partly for European television audiences, who wanted matches at a civilized hour in their own time zones, and were perhaps not fully thinking through what noon meant in Texas in summer. There were medical incidents. There was significant suffering. The matches were played, the goals were scored, and the players survived, mostly through sheer professional stubbornness. Dallas declared the tournament a success. Its residents, wringing sweat from their replica jerseys, were somewhat less emphatic. The Cotton Bowl presented problems beyond temperature. It was, by the standards of the other American host venues, an older and less modernized facility. It had been built in 1930 and had been hosting events in the Texas summer for 6 decades, which meant it had been built with a kind of pragmatic relationship with extreme heat, an acceptance that conditions would be difficult rather than an engineering response to the difficulty. The existing shade coverage was minimal. The stadium orientation meant that afternoon matches put most of the spectator seating in direct solar exposure for the majority of the game. For fans arriving from northern European countries where a warm summer day means 65 degrees and a light breeze, the Cotton Bowl in June was a genuinely shocking environment. Several international media organisations posted reporters specifically to write about the heat as a story in itself. The temperature at field level during the noon kickoffs was measured at over 100 degrees Fahrenheit on multiple match days. FIFA's scheduling for American television had placed a significant number of group stage matches at noon local time. The logic was European broadcast windows. A noon kickoff in Dallas was 6 or 7 in the evening in Western Europe, which was prime viewing time for the audiences that generated the most lucrative television rights. The calculation was purely financial and made complete sense if you were sitting in Zurich. If you were a Swedish midfielder warming up on the Cotton Bowl grass at 11:30 in the morning in 98-degree heat, it made rather less sense. Players from cooler climates suffered most visibly. Training sessions in the days before matches were shortened and rescheduled to early mornings or late evenings. Hydration protocols were revised. Medical staff travelled with expanded supplies of intravenous fluids. FIFA's own medical observers filed reports noting that conditions at Dallas were at the outer limits of what could be considered safe for elite athletic competition. Nobody cancelled the matches. The show, as it always does, went on. But the Dallas experience became a reference point in subsequent debates about World Cup scheduling and host city selection, a cautionary example of what happens when commercial television logic and human physiology arrive at fundamentally different conclusions about what time of day is appropriate for running around in Texas in summer. The Pontiac Silverdome outside Detroit made history at the 1994 World Cup by becoming the first indoor stadium to host a World Cup match, a sentence that should immediately raise several questions, the main one being, why? The Silverdome was a domed stadium with an artificial turf surface, neither of which was remotely compatible with FIFA's requirements for natural grass and open-air play. The solution, executed at considerable expense, was to install a natural grass surface inside a climate-controlled dome, which sounds simple and was, in practice, an engineering project of staggering complexity. The grass had to be grown in large modular sections elsewhere, transported to the stadium, and assembled into a playable surface under artificial lighting conditions calibrated to simulate sunlight. Special ventilation systems were installed, humidity levels were carefully monitored, entire teams of agronomists were involved. The grass was, by most accounts, acceptable. The atmosphere inside the dome was described as unusual, something between a sporting event and a very large greenhouse. But the matches were played, the tournament moved on, and Pontiac was left with an expensive custom installation it had absolutely no use for afterward. The decision to include the Silver Dome as a host venue was driven primarily by capacity and geography. The Detroit metropolitan area was a major American city with a large international population, particularly significant communities from the Middle East, Latin America, and Eastern Europe for whom soccer was not an exotic novelty. The organising committee wanted Midwestern representation, and the Silver Dome, with its capacity approaching 80,000, fit the logistical requirements on paper. The fact that it was an indoor dome was acknowledged as a challenge and described, in the bid documentation, as a challenge that could be overcome with proper engineering. This was technically true. It was also the kind of technically true statement that sounds considerably more reassuring before the engineering bill arrives. The grass installation project became one of the more extraordinary horticultural operations in American sporting history. The modular turf sections had to be grown at a specialist facility where the specific soil composition, root depth, and surface density could be controlled to FIFA's specifications. Each section was grown under artificial lights calibrated to simulate the solar spectrum required for healthy grass growth. The sections were then transported to the Silver Dome on flatbed trucks, laid in sequence over the existing artificial turf surface, and stitched together at the seams. The entire assembly operation took weeks. Once installed, the grass required continuous monitoring. Lighting schedules had to be maintained, irrigation systems run at precise intervals, temperature and humidity inside the dome managed to keep the surface healthy. The ventilation problem was its own challenge. A natural grass surface produces moisture through transpiration. Inside a sealed dome, that moisture has nowhere to go. Engineers installed additional ventilation systems specifically to manage the humidity generated by tens of thousands of square feet of living grass in an enclosed environment. Players who trained on the surface in the days before matches reported that the atmosphere inside felt dense and slightly strange, warm, humid, with the smell of cut grass concentrated in a way that normally only happens outdoors after rain. Broadcast journalists described the experience of watching a match inside the dome as genuinely disorienting. It looked like soccer. It sounded approximately like soccer. But something about the scale of the ceiling and the consistency of the artificial light made it feel like a very convincing simulation of soccer rather than the thing itself. The matches counted in the official records. The players were real. The grass was real. But the Silver Dome World Cup experience existed in its own particular category. The 1994 World Cup USA Organizing Committee, known officially as World Cup USA 1994 Incorporated, was a non-profit corporation set up specifically to manage the tournament. It was run by Alan Rothenberg, a Los Angeles sports lawyer who had been instrumental in landing the bid in the first place, and who would spend the next several years discovering that the gap between securing a major international sporting event and actually running it without catastrophic financial consequences was wider than anticipated. The organising committee's initial budget was ambitious. The revised budget was more ambitious. The final tally by the time the tournament concluded had expanded considerably beyond either figure, which is a pattern so consistent in major event planning that it has essentially been formalised into a kind of unofficial law. The committee was responsible for coordinating 9 host cities, dozens of national delegations, the world's media, FIFA's representatives, and the US federal government, all of whom had opinions, requirements, and invoices. The organisational achievement, when you step back and look at it whole, was genuinely impressive. The financial architecture underneath it was considerably less so. The organising committee was staffed at its peak by hundreds of full-time employees and thousands of contractors, consultants, and temporary workers. It maintained offices in multiple cities. It managed logistics that included transportation for 32 national teams, credentials for over 10,000 media representatives, and the operational requirements of 9 major stadiums simultaneously. It negotiated with television networks, sponsors, city governments, FIFA, the federal government, the Secret Service, and an assortment of other stakeholders who each had their own requirements, and none of whom were particularly interested in simplifying the committee's task. The organisation that emerged from this was, by the assessment of international event management experts, genuinely capable. It delivered the tournament, which is not a small thing. What it could not deliver was a budget that bore a consistent relationship to its original projections. The initial budget, assembled in the late 1980s, was built on assumptions about cost that proved difficult to maintain as the tournament approached. Staffing cost grew as the complexity of the operation became clear. Technology costs, particularly around broadcasting infrastructure and communications, expanded rapidly as the relevant technologies themselves changed between the late 80s and 1994. Security costs escalated as the post-Cold War threat environment in the early 90s proved more complex than anticipated. Venue preparation costs at several stadiums ran substantially over initial estimates. Each individual overrun was explicable. The cumulative effect of all of them together was a budget that had drifted significantly from its starting point by the time the tournament arrived. The revenue side performed well. Ticket sales exceeded expectations in most venues. Sponsorship income met its targets. Broadcasting rights, particularly the international deals, came in at strong numbers. The overall financial position of the organising committee at the end of the tournament was a surplus. It had taken in more than it spent. This was reported publicly and cited as evidence of the tournament's financial success. The question of whether the surplus was distributed equitably among the stakeholders who had contributed to generating it, particularly the host cities, was a separate question, one that received less prominent treatment in the post-tournament communications and rather more prominent treatment in the subsequent investigations. American television networks in 1994 had a complicated relationship with soccer, which is a polite way of saying they were deeply skeptical that anyone in America would watch it. The tournament was broadcast on a combination of ABC and ESPN, with Spanish-language coverage on Univision, and the negotiations over those rights were a fascinating window into how badly the American sports media establishment had miscalibrated its own audience. Ratings for English-language coverage were modest, confirming the network's fears. Ratings for Univision, however, were extraordinary. The Spanish-language broadcasts consistently outperformed the English ones, sometimes by substantial margins, a fact that surprised everyone in positions of authority and surprised absolutely no one who actually lived in communities where soccer was not a novelty. The television money helped, but it did not fully offset costs, and the long-term legacy of those ratings figures was complicated. They proved the audience existed. They also proved that American sports media had been largely ignoring it for years. The rights negotiations had been delicate. ABC and ESPN, both owned by Capital Cities Communications at the time, were the dominant powers in American sports broadcasting and had the infrastructure and reach the tournament required. But they were not enthusiastic. Internal discussions at the networks, some of which surfaced in trade press reporting at the time, reflected genuine uncertainty about whether soccer could generate the ratings that would justify the rights fees being asked. The sport had failed on American television before. The North American Soccer League's television experiments in the late 70s and early 80s had produced numbers that were, to put it gently, humbling. There was no particular reason to believe 1994 would be different. The networks negotiated accordingly, securing rights at fees that reflected their skepticism rather than the actual scale of the event. This would turn out to be a significant miscalculation, though not in the direction the networks had feared. The English language ratings, when they came in, were mediocre by American primetime standards. The United States matches drew reasonably well. Americans are reliably interested in American teams, regardless of the sport, but matches not involving the home nation attracted smaller audiences than the networks had hoped. Commentators hired for the broadcasts were, in several cases, visibly learning the sport in real time, which did not help. The production values were strong. The technical side of the broadcasting was handled with American sports television's characteristic professionalism, but the interpretive layer, the analysis and commentary that helps a viewer understand what they are watching, was inconsistent in ways that reflected how new all of this was for the people delivering it. Univision told a completely different story. The Spanish-language broadcaster had secured its rights at a fraction of what the English-language networks paid, correctly reading its own audience's enthusiasm while the larger networks were focused on their own uncertainty. When the tournament arrived, Univision's coverage became an event in itself, passionate, expert, emotionally committed in a way that English-language coverage was still finding its way toward. The ratings were not just good for a Spanish-language network, they were good by any standard. Individual matches on Univision drew audiences that exceeded the corresponding English-language broadcasts, in some cases by significant margins. The demographic implications of this were considerable and were discussed extensively in media industry publications in the months following the tournament. They were not acted on comprehensively for another decade, which is its own story about how slowly large institutions respond to evidence that contradicts their assumptions. The television legacy of 1994 was real but uneven. It confirmed that a soccer audience existed in the United States and was larger than the mainstream sports media had believed. It demonstrated the gap between the sport's penetration in English-speaking communities and its deep roots in Spanish-speaking ones. And it set the stage for the broadcasting negotiations around Major League Soccer's launch 2 years later, negotiations that were conducted with a somewhat more accurate picture of the available audience, though still, as it would turn out, with plenty of room for further miscalculation. World Cup tickets for the 1994 tournament were distributed through a system that, in retrospect, seems almost perfectly designed to ensure they ended up in the wrong hands. Large allocations went to FIFA member associations, corporate sponsors, and hospitality packages. Actual soccer fans, the kind who knew the sport, cared about it, and would have created the atmosphere of a proper international tournament, were left scrambling through an allocation process that was confusing, inconsistently administered, and widely accused of favouring those with connections over those with passion. The official merchandise operation, run through FIFA-approved channels, with all the appropriate licensing fees and royalty structures in place, was extensive and profitable. The unofficial operation, running parallel to it on sidewalks and from van trunks, was also extensive and considerably more profitable per unit, given the absence of licensing costs. FIFA and the local authorities made periodic efforts to shut down the unlicensed vendors, with results that were, in practice, mixed. For every cart confiscated and vendor moved along, 3 more appeared around the corner. The result was stadiums that were full but sometimes oddly quiet, filled with people who had obtained tickets through corporate channels and were present largely for the experience of being present rather than for the soccer itself. The allocation structure was, by FIFA's standards of the time, fairly conventional. Each of the 32 participating national associations received a block of tickets, typically around 8% of the stadium capacity for matches involving their own team and smaller allocations for other games. FIFA itself retained a significant portion for hospitality, officials, and partners. The organising committee held blocks for domestic sale. Sponsors received packages tied to their agreements. The official public sale, the portion theoretically available to ordinary fans who wanted to watch the matches, was whatever remained after all of those prior claims had been satisfied. In practice, this meant that the public allocation for high-demand matches, anything involving Brazil, Germany, Italy, or the host United States, was modest relative to the actual level of interest. The secondary market that developed around this scarcity was, by 1994 standards, remarkably sophisticated. Scalpers operated openly outside stadiums in most host cities, selling tickets at multiples of face value with the calm confidence of people who understood that enforcement was inconsistent and demand was absolute. Prices for the United States group stage matches reached levels that made them inaccessible to many of the fans who most wanted to attend, including large numbers of recent immigrants from soccer-playing countries who would have brought genuine atmosphere and knowledge to the stadiums but could not afford the markup. The people who ended up in the seats at many matches were often corporate guests, tournament officials, friends and families, or affluent general interest spectators who were there for the occasion rather than the sport. The atmospheric consequences of this were visible in the broadcasts. Television cameras could not always find the sections of genuine passionate support that give international soccer its characteristic intensity, the singing, the coordinated chanting, the flags, the colour. Those sections existed, particularly in cities with large relevant immigrant communities, but they were scattered through stadiums otherwise populated by people who applauded politely and looked mildly uncertain about when to stand up. The gap between a World Cup atmosphere as experienced in South America or Southern Europe and what was delivered inside American football stadiums in 1994 was a recurring subject of commentary from international journalists who filed dispatches describing the crowds as enthusiastic but somehow muted. They were not wrong. The enthusiasm was real. But enthusiasm and knowledge are different things, and the ticket distribution system had systematically underweighted the latter. FIFA reviewed its allocation procedures after 1994 and made modifications for subsequent tournaments. The underlying tension between commercial imperatives and the fan experience was not resolved. It has not been resolved at any World Cup since, but the specific dysfunction of 1994's system was acknowledged and partially addressed. In the meantime, the scalpers did very well. The United States men's national soccer team entered the 1994 World Cup with a record suggesting that optimism should be rationed carefully. They had qualified automatically as hosts, an arrangement that spared them the usual gauntlet of elimination matches, but also meant they had not exactly proven themselves on the field against top international opposition. What followed was one of the strangest sporting stories of the decade. The Americans advanced out of their group stage, beating Colombia in a match that would have tragic consequences for Colombian soccer, and pushed eventual champions Brazil in the round of 16 before losing 1-0. For a country that had spent decades treating soccer as something that happened to other nations, it was quietly thrilling. Viewership spiked. Children who watched those matches started asking their parents for soccer balls. The US Soccer Federation found itself for the first time with something it had never quite managed to generate before: genuine momentum. None of the financial complications seemed to matter quite as much in those moments. The games were real. The emotion was real. And for a few weeks the country was watching. The team that represented the United States in 1994 was built from an unusual collection of players. Some were Americans who had gone to play professionally in Europe because there was no viable professional league at home, a situation that was both a sign of the sport's weakness in America and, paradoxically, of the quality that individual American players could reach when given the right environment. Others were veterans of the indoor soccer leagues that had kept the professional game alive in the United States through the lean years of the 1980s. The coach, Bora Milutinovic, was a Yugoslav-born tactician who had previously managed Mexico and Costa Rica at World Cups and had a particular gift for organising modest national teams into disciplined, defensively solid units, capable of overachieving their stated expectations. He was, in retrospect, exactly the right coach for that particular team in that particular circumstance. The opening match against Switzerland ended 0-0, a result that was, by the standards of international soccer, perfectly respectable, and that was received by the American sports media with the cautious enthusiasm of people who had expected something worse. The match against Colombia was different. The Americans won 2-1, with Colombia's Andres Escobar putting the ball into his own net in circumstances that the American midfielder John Harkes later said he could not have predicted in a million years of practice. The victory meant the United States advanced from the group stage, the first time they had done so in a World Cup since 1930. The sports media, which had been covering the tournament with the dutiful professionalism of journalists assigned to a story they didn't entirely understand, suddenly found the story much easier to tell. The round of 16 match against Brazil, played in Stanford Stadium in the July heat of the San Francisco Bay Area, was the tournament's high point for American soccer. The United States defended with enormous discipline, absorbed Brazilian pressure for over an hour, and created genuine chances of their own, before Bebeto scored the only goal of the match with 20 minutes remaining. The Americans were eliminated. They had not been embarrassed. For a country that had spent decades being told it would never be competitive in the world's most popular sport, the distinction mattered enormously. The players were welcomed home with coverage that felt, for the first time, like the American sports media was taking soccer seriously rather than covering it as a curiosity. The momentum was real. What the Federation did with it would determine everything that came next. The Colombia match against the United States on June 22, 1994, is remembered for reasons that go far beyond the scoreline. Colombia arrived in America as one of the tournament favourites, a gifted, technically brilliant team expected to challenge for the title. They lost 2-1 to the Americans, partly as a result of an own goal by defender Andres Escobar. When Escobar returned home to Medellin after Colombia's early elimination, he was shot and killed outside a restaurant. The murder, carried out by men connected to drug trafficking organizations that had placed large bets on Colombia's performance, sent a shock through the sport that resonated for years. It was a reminder, arriving in the middle of a celebration of soccer's power to bring the world together, that the world also contained things soccer could not fix. The tournament continued. The matches went on. The stadiums filled again the following day. But the shadow of Escobar's death did not lift, and it still hasn't. His legacy became a part of the 1994 World Cup story in a way that no amount of organizational planning or economic projection had anticipated. Colombia had arrived in the United States with genuine credibility. The team managed by Francisco Maturana had qualified for the tournament in extraordinary fashion. A 7-1 demolition of Argentina in Buenos Aires had announced them to the world as something exceptional, and the expectations that followed that result were substantial. Pelé had named Colombia as one of his favourites to win the tournament. International journalists arrived at their training camp expecting to find a team ready to announce itself on the global stage. The players were technically skilled, tactically organised, and playing with an intensity that reflected both their talent and the enormous cultural weight of representing a country that had endured decades of violence and was, through its national soccer team, projecting something different to the world. What happened inside the Colombian camp in the days before the tournament was less visible. There were reports of threats, messages delivered to players and staff from people connected to organised crime, people who had wagered significant money on specific outcomes and who communicated their expectations in terms that were not metaphorical. The Colombian players were not naive about the environment they came from. Several of them had grown up in cities where the intersection of soccer, money and violence was not abstract. They played anyway. They had to. Withdrawing was not a realistic option, and for most of them, representing Colombia at a World Cup was the fulfillment of everything they had worked toward. They took the field against Romania in their opening match, lost 1-3 in a result that shocked everyone, and arrived at the United States match needing a result they could not deliver. Escobar's own goal, a deflection from a cross that redirected the ball past his goalkeeper in a way he could not have anticipated and could not have prevented, was the kind of thing that happens in soccer matches. It was not negligence. It was not betrayal. It was the random, cruel geometry of a ball in motion. He knew, even as it happened, what it might mean. Teammates reported that he was composed in the dressing room afterward. He understood the context. On July 2nd, 10 days after the match, he was shot multiple times in a parking lot in Medellin. He was 27 years old. The men convicted of his murder were connected to a cartel that had lost money on Colombia's performance. Escobar had apologized publicly to his country for the own goal in a newspaper column. The column was titled "Thanks for the Memories." He had written it knowing what might be coming. That detail, when it emerged, was almost impossible to read. The tournament processed his death with the awkward machinery of a global event that cannot stop for grief. Matches were played, goals were scored, the bracket advanced. Players from other nations wore black armbands. FIFA issued a statement. The soccer went on, as soccer always does, because the alternative is to acknowledge how completely the sport is embedded in a world that is not always safe or just. Escobar's name has been attached to the 1994 World Cup ever since, not as a footnote, but as a permanent part of its meaning. The 1994 World Cup was, among other things, a masterwork of corporate sponsorship that set templates still being used today and generated revenue streams that flowed impressively, though not always in the direction host cities might have hoped. Companies paid extraordinary sums for the right to associate themselves with the tournament. The FIFA marketing machine was already formidably developed by 1994, having spent years perfecting the art of selling exclusivity. Official sponsors received protections so comprehensive that competing brands were essentially erased from the tournament's visual landscape. Non-sponsor companies that had businesses near stadiums were required to remove signage during match days. At one point, a vendor selling a non-official soft drink was instructed to cover his cart with a tarpaulin for the duration of an event because the liquid he was selling competed with an official partner. The sponsor money was real, it was significant, and it flowed primarily to FIFA and the organising committee. For the host cities, the calculus was different. They had paid for the infrastructure, absorbed the construction costs, managed the traffic and security, and watched as the sponsorship revenue they had been quietly counting on was concentrated at the top of the financial structure rather than distributed in their direction. The sponsorship structure FIFA had developed by 1994 was the product of over a decade of deliberate commercial evolution. João Avelange, who had been FIFA's president since 1974, had transformed the organisation from a relatively modest administrative body into a commercial enterprise of significant scale, partnering with the Swiss sports marketing company ISL to sell World Cup rights in packages that were, by the standards of international sporting events, groundbreaking in their comprehensiveness. The official partner roster for 1994 included brands like Coca-Cola, Adidas, MasterCard, McDonald's, Fujifilm and JVC, global companies that paid fees in the tens of millions for the right to use the World Cup trademark and to be associated with the tournament's imagery. In exchange, they received exclusivity. No competitor could be seen, heard or implied within the tournament's commercial environment. The practical enforcement of this exclusivity generated some of the more memorable absurdities of the tournament. The commercial exclusion zones around stadiums required local businesses to audit their own signage and products against the official sponsor list. A restaurant that served Pepsi had to either switch products for match days, stop selling soft drinks entirely, or cover its signage in ways that satisfied the FIFA inspection team. Hardware stores, pharmacies, and other entirely unrelated businesses occasionally found themselves in technical violation of exclusion zone rules because they sold a product, a camera brand, a credit card processor, a particular soft drink that competed with an official partner. The enforcement was inconsistent but real, and the businesses that bore the compliance costs received nothing in return except the privilege of being located near a very large event. For the official sponsors, the investment was largely justified. Brand visibility at a tournament watched by 30 billion cumulative television viewers globally was genuinely valuable, and the post-tournament research that sponsors commission consistently showed positive returns on brand recognition and purchase intent. The World Cup worked as a commercial vehicle, which is why the same companies kept coming back for subsequent tournaments. The financial structure that made it work so well for sponsors and for FIFA was the same structure that made it complicated for host cities, a highly optimized system for extracting value upward through the commercial hierarchy, with the cities and local communities at the base providing the physical and civic infrastructure that made the whole thing possible. Every host city spent money on infrastructure improvements in the run-up to the tournament, justified publicly as legacy investments that would benefit residents long after the soccer was over. Roads were widened, transit systems received upgrades, hotels were renovated, stadiums were retrofitted. The improvements were real, in most cases genuine and tangible additions to city infrastructure that the populations would use for years. The question was whether the return justified the investment, and the answer, examined carefully, was complicated. Some improvements genuinely delivered long-term value. Others were specific to the tournament in ways that made them largely useless afterward. Temporary facilities built to FIFA specifications were dismantled the moment the last match ended, leaving behind nothing but receipts. In several cities, the honest accounting, the total cost of hosting weighed against the total revenue generated locally, produced numbers that were uncomfortable to look at directly, which may explain why a number of cities declined to perform that accounting publicly until several years had passed. Infrastructure investment before major events follows a pattern that urban economists have documented extensively enough to name it. Cities overestimate the leverage a single event provides and underestimate the degree to which preparation costs are front-loaded, while benefits, if they arrive at all, are distributed across years or decades. The improvements happen before the event, on a compressed timeline that drives up construction costs. The event happens, generating a brief period of elevated economic activity. The event ends, the visitors leave, and the city is left with infrastructure whose value depends entirely on whether the specific improvements made sense for the city's long-term needs, or whether they were calibrated primarily to FIFA's requirements for a 6-week tournament. In Dallas, Road improvements around the Cotton Bowl were genuine infrastructure investments that served the neighbourhood for years afterward. In other cities, the calculus was less clear. Temporary media facilities, constructed to specifications that had no application outside the tournament context, were erected and dismantled within months. Communications infrastructure installed for broadcast purposes was largely incompatible with the existing city systems and had limited post-tournament utility. Security infrastructure, fencing, checkpoints, surveillance systems was removed when the tournament ended. Hotel rooms built or renovated specifically to meet FIFA's accommodation requirements found themselves, in several cities, in markets that did not have sufficient underlying demand to fill them once the tournament crowd had gone home. The transportation improvements were the category most likely to produce genuine legacy value, and the results were mixed. Public transit systems in cities that invested in expansion or modernisation during the pre-tournament period generally benefited over the long term, as those improvements served regular users long after the tournament had ended. Road improvements in the immediate vicinity of stadiums were similarly durable, but these represented a fraction of the total infrastructure spending, the visible tip of a much larger investment whose deeper layers were less easily justified in post-tournament accounting. City governments that had championed the infrastructure narrative found themselves, in subsequent budget cycles, having to explain line items that had been packaged as legacy investments but were performing, in practice, as sunk costs. The explanation most commonly offered was that the intangible benefits, the civic pride, the international visibility, the boost to the city's global profile made up the difference. This argument was impossible to disprove and difficult to substantiate. Natural grass at an American football stadium in summer is not a naturally stable substance. American football stadiums in 1994 predominantly used artificial turf, field turf, and its predecessors, because artificial surfaces were cheaper to maintain and more durable under the punishment of regular football use. FIFA required natural grass. This was not a negotiable point. The result was an ongoing national drama played out across 9 host cities, in which teams of groundskeepers, agronomists and horticulturalists battled heat, humidity, drainage problems, compaction, wear patterns, and in at least one case a fungal infection to maintain surfaces that met FIFA's minimum standards. The grass at Stanford Stadium needed emergency resodding between matches. The surface at the Citrus Bowl in Orlando, which was already dealing with Florida's particular relationship with heat and moisture, required near constant intervention. At several venues, post-match inspection reports from FIFA catalogued surface deficiencies in language that was diplomatic, but clearly communicating that the grass was in distress. The groundskeeping crews did heroic work under genuinely difficult conditions. The grass mostly survived. And when the tournament ended and the stands emptied, several of those carefully maintained surfaces were removed, discarded, and replaced with the artificial turf the stadiums had always preferred. The choice of grass variety was itself a subject of significant specialist debate in the months before the tournament. Different regions of the United States have different climatic conditions, and the grass varieties that perform best in those conditions differ accordingly. Cool season grasses, the type used on most natural surface sports fields in northern states, struggle in the heat of a Texas or Florida summer. Warm season grasses, which thrive in southern heat, have different structural properties that affected play. The organising committee worked with turfgrass specialists to select varieties appropriate to each venue's conditions, a process that was more complicated than it sounds, because the stadiums themselves created microclimates that differed from the surrounding region. A grass variety that performed well in the open air of Dallas performed differently inside the Silverdome's climate-controlled environment, under artificial lighting in controlled humidity. The agronomists hired to manage the Silverdome installation were doing work that had no real precedent in professional sports. Wear patterns became a dominant concern once the tournament began. Soccer subjects a grass surface to different stresses than American football. The continuous movement, the sharp directional changes, the concentrated activity in certain areas of the field, particularly the penalty areas and the central channel, create wear patterns that develop rapidly under match conditions. After a group stage match on a surface that had been installed over existing artificial turf, the underlying structure of the grass could be visibly compromised in the heavily trafficked zones. The organic layer was shallow. There was no deep root system established over years of growth, as there would be on a natural surface stadium that had been maintained over time, and the grass could not regenerate quickly enough between matches to fully recover. Emergency. Resodding operations, bringing in fresh modular sections to replace the most damaged areas, were conducted at multiple venues between rounds. The logistics of this were considerable. The replacement sections had to match the existing surface in grass variety, soil composition, and surface density. They had to be sourced, transported, installed, and watered within the brief windows between matches. Groundskeeping teams that had been working around the clock for weeks found themselves extending their hours further. The operations mostly succeeded. The surfaces were playable, which was the minimum required standard. Whether they were optimal playing surfaces for the world's best soccer players is a different question. The players who were professional and adaptable made no significant public complaints. Some of them, in private interviews years later, described the surfaces at certain venues with language that was considerably more descriptive. One of the things the 1994 World Cup genuinely got right was its volunteers. Tens of thousands of Americans, many of them immigrants or the children of immigrants from soccer-loving countries, many of them simply people who wanted to be part of something, signed up to work the tournament without pay, serving as translators, guides, drivers, stadium assistants, and general logistical support. In a country where soccer's professional infrastructure barely existed, the volunteer network became the connective tissue holding the whole operation together. They spoke dozens of languages. They navigated cultural differences with grace. They met bewildered international visitors at airports and delivered them, somehow, to the correct stadiums in cities those visitors had never visited, on roads those visitors had never driven, for matches that were happening in buildings that had been something entirely different 6 months before. The volunteers were celebrated during the tournament, and then, as volunteers at major events inevitably are, largely forgotten afterward. Some of them would go on to build careers in soccer administration. Many of them still have their uniforms in a closet somewhere. The volunteer recruitment had begun years before the tournament, organised through a network of local soccer associations, community organisations, universities and civic groups. The organising committee had set a target number that seemed ambitious when first announced and proved, when applications arrived, to be easily exceeded. The demand to be part of the tournament was greater than anyone had projected. People applied from every state in the country, from every background imaginable, with motivations that ranged from deep personal attachment to soccer, families who had immigrated from Brazil or Italy or Mexico, for whom the World Cup was as significant as any event in their lives, to simple curiosity about being inside something historically large. The multilingual capacity of the volunteer corps was its most practically valuable attribute. Official communications at a World Cup happen in FIFA's 4 working languages: English, French, Spanish, and German. But the actual day-to-day interactions between volunteers, visitors, and stadium staff occurred in whatever language the person in front of you happened to speak. The tournament drew visitors from 32 participating nations and many more that hadn't qualified. At any given stadium entrance on any given match day, the crowd pressing toward the turnstiles might include speakers of Portuguese, Italian, Romanian, Korean, Nigerian English, Saudi Arabic, Bolivian Spanish, Irish English, and at least a dozen other linguistic variants that standard tournament communications did not address. The volunteers who happened to speak those languages, and in a country of immigrants many of them did, became irreplaceable. What the volunteers provided that no amount of organisational planning could fully substitute for was human warmth. International visitors arriving in an unfamiliar country, navigating an unfamiliar transport system, trying to find a stadium in a city they'd never visited, were regularly rescued by volunteers who gave not just directions but genuine hospitality. People who were genuinely glad the world had come to their city and communicated that gladness in ways that went beyond their job descriptions. Post-tournament surveys of international visitors consistently cited the friendliness and helpfulness of tournament staff, meaning largely the volunteers, as one of the standout positive experiences of the tournament. The volunteers did not receive this feedback. They'd gone home by then, back to their regular lives, carrying memories of something extraordinary that had lasted 6 weeks, and then, as all tournaments do, ended completely. Somewhere north of 10,000 accredited journalists descended on the United States for the 1994 World Cup, representing news organisations from every country that had qualified for the tournament and several that hadn't. They arrived expecting to cover soccer, and found themselves also covering America's relationship with soccer, a story that many of them found genuinely baffling. The dominant narrative in international media was something between affectionate bemusement and mild condescension. The world's most popular sport was being hosted by the one major nation that had never fully embraced it, in stadiums built for other games, staffed by people who had to be briefed on the offside rule. American journalists, for their part, gamely attempted to explain soccer to audiences for whom the sport was either completely unknown or very recently discovered, producing some coverage that was enthusiastic, some that was bewildered, and some that tried to frame every match in terms of American sports metaphors that didn't quite map onto what was actually happening on the field. The translation was imperfect. The enthusiasm, in many cases, was genuine. The media centre operations at each host stadium were substantial. FIFA's accreditation requirements meant that journalists needed to be processed, credentialed, and provided with working facilities that met international broadcast standards. Press boxes had to be expanded, communications lines had to be installed, translation services had to be available. Catering, because this is the kind of thing that matters enormously to large groups of journalists working long hours, had to be adequate. The organising committee had invested heavily in the media infrastructure and, by most professional assessments, delivered working conditions that range from acceptable to genuinely good. The physical operations worked. The cultural interface between international sports media and American soccer coverage was considerably more complicated. European journalists filed dispatches that were, depending on the outlet, either affectionately curious or pointedly condescending about American soccer knowledge. A recurring story involved encounters with American spectators who didn't understand the offside rule, which is perhaps the single most reliably confusing rule in any major sport, and which was, in 1994, genuinely novel to a large portion of the American audience encountering it for the first time. British tabloids in particular ran pieces that mined this material with considerable relish, portraying American soccer fans as cheerful, well-meaning, and comprehensively uninformed. The pieces were not entirely inaccurate. They were also not entirely fair, given that the same British tabloids would have struggled to explain the infield fly rule or the salary cap structure of the NFL. American sports journalists covered the tournament with the defensive enthusiasm of people who knew they were being watched by their international counterparts and wanted to demonstrate competence. The better ones did. The New York Times, the Washington Post, and several regional papers assigned writers who had genuine soccer knowledge and produced coverage that held up well against international standards. Sports Illustrated ran deep features on the tournament's major stories. On television, the commentary was more uneven. ESPN had hired a mixture of experienced soccer commentators and American sports broadcasters who were learning the sport in real time, and the results reflected that mixture. Viewers who knew soccer could tell the difference. The ones who didn't were at least getting enthusiastic coverage from people who were as new to all of this as they were, which created its own kind of shared discovery. The security apparatus deployed for the 1994 World Cup was substantial enough that people who worked on it later described it as among the most complex domestic security operations in American history up to that point. 32 national teams, dozens of heads of state and senior government officials in attendance at various matches, 9 cities across the country, hundreds of thousands of international visitors, and a threat environment that included the full spectrum of post-Cold War concerns about international terrorism. All of it required coordination between federal, state, and local law enforcement at a scale that had rarely been attempted. The FBI, the Secret Service, the State Department, and the intelligence community were all involved. Individual host cities contributed their own police and security resources, which they then billed to the tournament, which billed it back to the overall budget, which continued to grow. The security operation worked, the tournament passed without major incident, and its cost was incorporated into the overall tally of what the 1994 World Cup actually cost to run, adding another substantial line to the invoice that was quietly accumulating in the background. The threat assessment that shaped the security planning had been developed in the years preceding the tournament and reflected the specific concerns of the early 1990s. The Cold War had recently ended, but its conclusion had not simplified the security environment. In some ways, it had complicated it, as previously stable arrangements began to shift and new threat actors emerged in the space left by the old superpower confrontation. The Middle East was a consistent source of concern. Ireland was in the final stages of the Troubles, and the presence of both the Republic of Ireland and Northern Irish-born players on various teams added a dimension that required specific attention. Several participating nations brought with them security concerns related to their own domestic political situations that had to be managed within the host country's infrastructure. The coordination between federal and local authorities was, by the accounts of participants, genuinely difficult. Each of the 9 host cities had its own law enforcement command structure, its own procedures, and its own relationship with the federal agencies whose jurisdiction overlapped with theirs. Creating a unified security operation across 9 cities simultaneously required a command architecture that had to be built largely from scratch, because nothing quite like it had been attempted before. Intelligence had to be shared across multiple agencies that had varying levels of comfort with sharing. Decision-making authority had to be clearly allocated between local and federal levels in advance, because the time pressure of an actual security incident was not conducive to jurisdictional negotiation. The security presence at match venues was visible and substantial. Perimeter security extended well beyond the stadium boundaries, incorporating the commercial exclusion zones into a broader controlled environment. Vehicle access was restricted on match days. Bag searches were conducted at multiple entry points. The combination of these measures meant that stadium entry processes were slow. International visitors used to more streamlined entry procedures at European venues found the American security experience notably more intensive. The lines were long, the procedures were thorough. Nobody was particularly happy about it, but nobody made the case that it was unnecessary, because by 1994 the world had enough experience of large public events and what could happen at them to understand why careful security mattered. The tournament passed safely. The planning that produced that outcome was expensive, complicated, and almost entirely invisible to the spectators whose safety it protected. International soccer players in 1994 were not, as a group, prepared for American summer weather. They came from places with reasonable climates, or at least climates their bodies recognised, and arrived in host cities where June and July had apparently decided to conduct experiments in human endurance. Players training in the days before matches described conditions unlike anything in their domestic seasons. Coaching staffs that had prepared meticulous tactical plans found themselves improvising hydration protocols instead. Several matches, particularly those scheduled for midday kickoffs to accommodate European television, were played in conditions that FIFA's own medical observers later described as at the outer edge of acceptable. Players cramped on the field. Substitutions were made not for tactical reasons, but for the basic human reason that the person being substituted had stopped being able to run properly. The heat affected the quality of play in matches throughout the tournament, particularly in the group stage, which meant that some of the most technically gifted players in the world were watched by an American public encountering them for the first time at something considerably below their best. This was, in retrospect, a mild branding problem for the sport. The physiological reality of playing elite soccer in extreme heat is worth understanding, because it goes some way toward explaining why certain matches at the 1994 World Cup looked the way they did. The human body, pushed to the aerobic limits of professional athletic competition, generates heat at a rate that the normal cooling mechanisms, sweating, increased circulation to the skin, can only partly manage under ordinary conditions. In extreme ambient heat, those mechanisms become progressively less effective. Core body temperature rises, decision-making degrades, muscle function deteriorates, cramps develop as electrolyte imbalances accumulate faster than hydration can correct them. A player who might run 12 kilometers in a match under European conditions might cover significantly less ground in Dallas in June, not because of lack of effort, but because the body is redirecting resources towards staying alive. The FIFA Medical Commission had established guidelines for match conditions that included temperature thresholds, above which additional precautions were required. Water breaks, brief pauses in play to allow players to hydrate, were authorised for matches exceeding certain temperature benchmarks. The implementation of these breaks was inconsistent. In some matches, they were applied promptly when conditions triggered the threshold. In others, there were delays. Players and coaches from several national teams filed formal complaints about the scheduling of noon kickoffs, arguing that the decision to prioritise European broadcast windows over player welfare was not an acceptable trade-off. The complaints were noted, acknowledged in diplomatic language, and did not change the schedule. The national teams that adapted best were generally those that had done the most systematic preparation. Brazil, accustomed to playing in tropical heat, was least affected. Some European teams had scheduled pre-tournament training camps in warm weather environments specifically to acclimatise their players, and their performances in the early round showed the benefit. Teams that arrived with limited acclimatisation, some of the smaller national associations simply did not have the resources for extended pre-tournament camps abroad, struggled most visibly in the group stage, with performances that looked flattering to no one, including themselves. The broader irony was not lost on observers. America had invested enormously in presenting soccer at its best. The stadiums, the infrastructure, the organisational machinery and the scheduling decisions had then ensured that the sport was played in several venues in conditions that systematically degraded performance quality. The soccer that American audiences saw in those noon kickoffs was real soccer, played by genuine world-class athletes, but it was world-class athletes suffering. It was technically competent, but physically constrained in ways that the sport at its best is not. The players got through it, most of them. The ones who cramped off the field in the 78th minute perhaps remember it differently. Every city that agreed to host World Cup matches was sold, alongside the financial projections and the sponsorship promises, a vision of legacy. The idea that hosting a major international event would leave behind something durable and meaningful that would outlast the tournament itself. The legacies were described in brochures and presentations with great specificity. Increased international tourism that would continue for years, elevated global profile for the host city, revitalized neighborhoods near stadium sites, infrastructure improvements with decades of useful life, and most importantly, a spark that would ignite American soccer at the grassroots level and build toward a permanent professional league. Some of these things happened. The infrastructure improvements were real, in varying degrees. The spark was real. Attendance at youth soccer programs increased noticeably in the years following the tournament. Major League Soccer launched in 1996, a direct descendant of the 1994 World Cup's organisational momentum. But the specific financial returns that had been promised, the direct economic benefits to individual cities from hosting their particular set of matches, were frequently much smaller than forecast, and in some cases the cost of hosting exceeded the locally retained revenues by margins that took years to fully account for. The legacy narrative served an important political function during the bidding process. City governments needed to justify the expenditure of public funds on a commercial entertainment event, and the justification required more than it will be exciting and the world will watch. It required a case that the money spent would generate returns that benefited the city's residents, not just the event's organisers. The legacy framework provided that case. The international tourism multiplier, the neighbourhood revitalisation around stadium sites, the infrastructure improvements that would serve generations, all of these were ways of arguing that hosting the World Cup was an investment rather than an expense, a distinction that mattered enormously in budget hearings but was considerably harder to demonstrate in post-event accounting. The neighbourhood revitalisation argument was among the weakest in practice. The stadiums selected as host venues were, without exception, large existing facilities in established locations, places that had been built decades earlier in their surrounding contexts, and that were not undergoing the kind of distressed redevelopment that might genuinely benefit from the attention and investment a major event brings. The areas around Giant Stadium in New Jersey, the Cotton Bowl in Dallas, the Rose Bowl in Pasadena, these were not deprived neighbourhoods waiting for a catalyst. They were suburban and semi-industrial zones adjacent to large sports facilities, and the World Cup's passage through them left them largely as it had found them. The foot traffic of match days generated some local commercial activity, which largely evaporated when the tournament ended and the stadiums returned to their irregular event schedules. The genuine legacy, the one that actually materialised and can be pointed to with reasonable confidence, was Major League Soccer. The tournament had demonstrated that there was a meaningful American audience for soccer, not a majority, not even close, but a real and commercially viable segment that could support a professional league if the league was structured and marketed correctly. The organising committee had committed to launching a domestic professional league as part of the original bid, and that commitment was honoured. MLS began play in 1996 with 10 teams and a distinctly American organisational model, a single-entity structure designed to prevent the financial instability that had destroyed the North American Soccer League. The legacy of 1994, measured in its most durable form, is the league that exists today. The cities that hosted the tournament can claim a share of that legacy, though the share is distributed somewhat unevenly between those whose investments contributed most directly and those whose contributions the accounting has tended to obscure. Understanding the finances of the 1994 World Cup requires understanding how FIFA's revenue-sharing arrangements actually worked, which is to say, primarily in FIFA's favour. The tournament generated revenues that were, by the standards of international sporting events, enormous ticket sales, broadcasting rights, sponsorship income, licensing fees, FIFA retained a substantial portion of these revenues directly. Member associations received allocations. The organising committee received a share sufficient to cover its operating costs with varying degrees of surplus. What individual host cities received, once the various layers of organisational structure had taken their portions, was frequently described by city officials, sometimes years after the fact, in unguarded moments with reporters, as disappointing. The gap between the promised economic windfall and the actual financial return was, in several cases, large enough to require political explanation. Some officials explained it confidently, citing infrastructure benefits and intangible gains in civic profile. Others explained it less confidently, in the manner of people who have spent considerable time trying to make numbers add up and are finding the arithmetic uncooperative. FIFA's financial structure in 1994 was the product of the commercial revolution that Avalanche and his partners at ISL had engineered over the previous 2 decades. The World Cup had been transformed from a modestly profitable sporting event into a commercial juggernaut whose revenue streams were diversified, carefully protected and allocated according to a hierarchy in which FIFA sat firmly at the top. Broadcasting rights, which were sold globally and represented the tournament's single largest revenue source, were negotiated and controlled directly by FIFA. The organising committee received a fee for hosting, a contribution toward the costs of running the event, but the underlying rights remained FIFA's assets. Sponsorship income flowed similarly. The official partner agreements were FIFA's contracts, and the revenues they generated were FIFA's to allocate. The host city governments had no direct claim on any of these revenue streams. Their financial relationship with the tournament was mediated through the host city agreements they had signed with the organising committee, and those agreements specified, in varying degrees of clarity, what the cities were entitled to receive and what they were obligated to provide. In general terms, the agreements offered revenue sharing from ticket sales at the host city's matches, a percentage of the gate receipts from games played in that city's stadium. The percentages varied by negotiation and were not publicly disclosed in most cases. What cities generally found, when the gate receipts were calculated and the percentages applied, was that the resulting figures were smaller than the overall economic impact projections had implied they would be. The distribution of surplus, the profit remaining after the organising committee had covered its costs, became the most publicly contentious financial issue arising from the tournament. The organising committee reported a surplus of over $50 million, which was distributed among FIFA, the US Soccer Federation, and World Cup USA 1994 Incan Zone reserves. City governments that had spent public funds on stadium preparation, security and infrastructure received no direct share of this surplus. Their contribution had been the precondition for the surplus's existence, but the financial structure of the tournament did not recognise the contribution as a claim on the resulting profits. It was legally exactly as specified in the contracts. It was, in human terms, the kind of arrangement that people who sign contracts without reading them carefully tend to object to afterward. World Cup USA 1994 Incorporated ended the tournament in a financial position that generated considerable controversy. The organising committee reported a surplus, meaning it had taken in more than it spent, which was by any normal measure a sign of success. The controversy arose from the fact that this surplus accrued to a private non-profit corporation rather than to the cities that had invested public funds in making the tournament possible. Alan Rothenberg and other senior officials received compensation packages that were, by the standards of non-profit administration, extremely generous, a fact that became public and produced a brief but intense period of public outrage. Congressional hearings were discussed, investigations were threatened. the optics of tournament organisers collecting large personal payouts, while host cities were still working out how to pay for stadium renovations, were, charitably speaking, not ideal. The controversy eventually receded, major events move on, the news cycle moves on, but it left a residue of scepticism about the financial structures of international sporting events that has informed debates about hosting ever since. The compensation figures that became public were striking in context. Rothenberg himself received a total compensation package that reports placed in the range of $7 million across the duration of his tenure with the organising committee, a figure that was, in 1994, extraordinary for the executive of a non-profit organisation. Other senior staff received packages that, while smaller, were similarly out of step with conventional non-profit compensation norms. The justification offered by the committee was that the scale and complexity of the operation had required talent that commanded market-rate compensation, and that the tournament's financial success validated those decisions. The alternative framing, that a private non-profit had paid its executives at commercial rates using revenues generated substantially by public infrastructure investment, was the one that produced the congressional interest. The non-profit designation of World Cup USA 1994 Incorporated was itself a point of contention. Non-profit status in the United States carries specific legal obligations. Organizations are required to operate in furtherance of a public benefit, rather than for private profit, and critics argued that an entity paying multi-million-dollar compensation packages to its leadership while retaining a substantial surplus was testing the limits of that designation. The Internal Revenue Service was reportedly among the bodies that examined the committee's financial records in the post-tournament period. The examination did not produce formal action, but the scrutiny was real, and the questions it raised were substantive. Rothenberg's defenders argued with some justification that the tournament had been a genuine organisational success. Delivering a 16-match tournament across 9 cities, coordinating 32 national teams, managing the world's media, and doing all of it without catastrophic incident, was an achievement that deserved recognition. The alternative, running the World Cup badly, embarrassing the country, producing the kind of organisational chaos that attaches itself to an event's legacy forever, had been a real possibility, and avoiding it required capable leadership. The compensation reflected the value of that leadership by this argument, and the fact that the tournament generated a surplus was evidence that the investment was sound. The argument was not unreasonable. It was also not sufficient to fully address the discomfort of the underlying situation. The cities that had borne the infrastructure costs received no surplus share. The volunteers who had provided tens of thousands of hours of free labour received no compensation. The small businesses that had been required to cover their signage and remove their products on match days received no reimbursement. The executive team of a private non-profit corporation received millions. The math was legal, the optics were not. If there is a clear, measurable, positive legacy of the 1994 World Cup that is not in dispute, it is Major League Soccer. The league launched in 1996, fulfilling a promise made to FIFA as part of the original bid, a condition that the United States would establish a permanent professional soccer league after the tournament. MLS began with 10 teams, modest salaries and attendance figures that were encouraging without being spectacular. It has grown over the 3 decades since into a genuinely substantial enterprise, with more than 24 clubs, international television contracts, and a talent level that has risen from respectable to genuinely competitive. The path from the 1994 World Cup to the current state of American soccer is not straight and was not smooth. There were ownership crises, franchises that failed, structural problems that took years to resolve. But the league exists. It is growing. it is producing American players who play at the highest levels of European soccer. None of that would have happened, or at least not when it did, without the 1994 tournament providing the organisational impetus and the public appetite to make it possible. The decision to structure MLS as a single-entity league was among the most consequential choices made in the period between the World Cup and the league's launch. In the conventional sports league model, individual clubs are separately owned businesses that compete commercially as well as athletically. They compete for players, for revenue, and occasionally for survival. The North American Soccer League had operated on this model and had collapsed partly because individual club owners, competing for talent in a global market, had driven player costs to levels the league's revenues could not sustain. The single-entity model addressed this by making all MLS club subsidiaries of the league itself, with individual investors purchasing operating rights rather than independent ownership. Player contracts were held by the league rather than the clubs. Salary levels were centrally controlled. The model was restrictive in ways that were commercially unorthodox and occasionally legally challenged, but it provided a financial discipline that kept the league solvent through its difficult early years. Those early years were genuinely difficult. Attendance was inconsistent. Some markets embraced the league immediately, while others struggled to generate interest even with the residual enthusiasm from the World Cup. Several of the original franchise markets, chosen partly for their World Cup connections, proved less commercially viable than hoped. The Tampa Bay Mutiny, the Dallas Burn, and the Miami Fusion all eventually ceased operations. The league contracted from 12 to 10 teams in 2002 in a restructuring that was, in the vocabulary of press releases, described as a realignment, and was, in ordinary language, a partial failure. But the league survived. It made the hard decisions that survival required. It found the markets that worked and invested in them. The transformation from survival to growth happened gradually, and then, at some point in the early 2010s, rapidly. The arrival of designated player rules, which allowed clubs to sign one or two players outside the normal salary structure, brought international stars to American cities and changed the league's commercial profile dramatically. Stadium construction, with MLS clubs building soccer-specific grounds rather than sharing NFL facilities, changed the game day experience in ways that created genuine atmospheres for the first time. Expansion into new markets, chosen with more commercial discipline than the original franchise awards, brought the league into cities with demonstrated soccer interest. None of these developments were inevitable. They were the result of decisions made by people who had learned from the first decade of the league's existence and applied those lessons carefully. The foundation they were building on, the audience that the 1994 World Cup had identified and partially created, was the indispensable starting point. After the final whistle blew at Giant Stadium on July 17, 1994, and Brazil had defeated Italy on penalties, and the last international fan had made his way to the airport, and the temporary grass had been rolled up and discarded, the host cities sat down with their accountants. What followed was a period of quiet financial reckoning that played out mostly in local government budget documents, city council meetings, and internal memos rather than in headlines. Some cities had performed better than expected, others had not. At least 2 host cities sought federal assistance through various programs to offset costs associated with the tournament, a fact that was documented in public records and reported by local journalists, but did not receive the national attention it perhaps deserved. The image of a city applying for federal aid to help cover the cost of hosting the World Cup sits somewhat uneasily alongside the promotional language about economic windfalls. It does not fit neatly into either the celebration narrative or the disaster narrative, which may be why it was reported quietly and then mostly forgotten. But it happened. The receipts exist. The federal assistance mechanisms available to cities in the post-tournament period were not specific to World Cup hosting, They were general infrastructure and community development programs that host cities applied to in the normal course of municipal finance. The connection to World Cup costs was real, but not always direct. A city that had taken on debt to finance stadium improvements might apply for federal community development funds to support neighbourhood programs in the area around the stadium, freeing up general revenue that could be applied to the debt service. A city that had upgraded its transportation infrastructure for the tournament might apply for federal transit funding for the ongoing operational cost of those upgrades. The accounting was layered enough that the relationship between the federal assistance and the World Cup costs was not always visible in a single budget line, which is perhaps why the broader story did not achieve more prominence. What was visible to anyone who looked carefully at the municipal budgets of host cities in the 2 or 3 years following the tournament was a pattern of financial constraint that was at least partly attributable to tournament-related spending. Cities that had taken on debt for stadium renovations were carrying that debt in subsequent budgets. Cities that had built or upgraded facilities that proved to have limited post-tournament utility were deprecating those investments against revenue streams that were no longer enhanced by the tournament's presence. The inflated hotel tax revenues, the elevated parking receipts, the temporary commercial activity of match days, all of it had ended when the tournament ended, leaving behind the fixed costs of the infrastructure that had been built to generate it. The political management of this reality required a particular kind of institutional communication, the kind that emphasizes the genuine positives, acknowledges challenges in general terms without specifics, and buries the uncomfortable details in documents that are technically public but practically obscure. City councils received briefings. Finance committees reviewed reports. The public narrative maintained through the local media's coverage of post-tournament accounting was generally one of qualified success. The tournament had cost more than expected. The returns had been somewhat below projections, but the infrastructure improvements were valuable, and the overall experience had been positive. This narrative was not entirely false. It was carefully incomplete. The full picture, assembled from the public records that exist for those who choose to find them, is somewhat less reassuring and somewhat more instructive about what happens when cities agree to host major international events without fully modelling what happens after the guests go home. International players who came to the United States for the 1994 World Cup left behind a fascinating record of first impressions. Many of them had never been to America before. They arrived in a country that was, by any measure, genuinely enthusiastic about hosting. The crowds were large, the welcome was warm, the facilities were modern, but which communicated its enthusiasm in ways that were sometimes culturally disorienting to people from countries where soccer was woven into the fabric of daily life. Several players noted in post-tournament interviews that American spectators applauded skillful play without necessarily understanding why it was skillful, which created an odd feedback loop where individual moments of brilliance were received enthusiastically, but the tactical architecture that made them possible went unremarked. Others were struck by the sheer scale of American stadiums, the noise, the food vendors, the general atmosphere of spectacle that differed from the more concentrated intensity of European and South American grounds. The experience was novel enough that it generated its own genre of player memoir, the What America Was Like chapter, which recurred in soccer autobiographies for years afterward. The training facilities provided to national teams were, by most assessments, among the best in World Cup history to that point. The organising committee had invested in practice sites that met or exceeded international standards, and the logistical support provided to delegations, transportation, hotel accommodation, catering, medical facilities was comprehensive in ways that reflected the American capacity for large-scale hospitality infrastructure. Players accustomed to training camps in European countries where the local facilities were adequate but not exceptional found themselves working on pitches that were well maintained and equipped, in hotels that were comfortable by any standard, supported by staff who were efficient and genuinely helpful. The physical experience of being in America was for most players a positive one. It was the cultural experience that generated the more interesting observations. The food was a subject of consistent commentary. American sports catering in 1994 was not calibrated for the dietary requirements of elite international athletes from countries with specific culinary traditions. Hotel restaurants attempted to accommodate the requests of national delegations with varying success. The Italian squad, reportedly, had their own catering arrangements. The Brazilian delegation brought specialists. Smaller national associations made do with what was available, which in several cases meant players eating approximations of their home cuisine prepared by people who were trying very hard but working with different ingredients in an unfamiliar tradition. Players from West African nations found the culinary options particularly challenging. Players from Germany found the portion sizes remarkable. Everyone across every national team had an opinion about the hamburgers. The crowds generated the most sustained commentary. Players who had spent their careers playing in front of European or South American audiences, where the relationship between the spectators and the sport has been cultivated over generations, where the chants are inherited and the rhythms of crowd engagement are almost instinctive, found the American stadium experience genuinely different. The crowds were large, often very large, and their enthusiasm was real. But the noise patterns were different. The silences fell in different places. The collective intelligence of the crowd, the shared understanding of what a particular moment meant tactically, the anticipation of what might happen next, was less consistent than players were accustomed to. Some found it liberating, playing in front of audiences who responded to the spectacle without the partisan intensity that can make certain European stadiums genuinely threatening. Others missed the depth of engagement. All of them found it interesting. Most of them, asked years later, said they were glad they had been there. Wherever the 1994 World Cup went, an informal economy followed it. Street vendors appeared outside every stadium selling replica jerseys, scarves, flags, hats, keychains, and a vast array of goods that range from the merely unlicensed to the outright counterfeit. The official merchandise operation, run through FIFA-approved channels with all the appropriate licensing fees and royalty structures in place, was extensive and profitable. The unofficial operation, running parallel to it on sidewalks and from van trunks, was also extensive and considerably more profitable per unit, given the absence of licensing costs. FIFA and the local authorities made periodic efforts to shut down the unlicensed vendors, with results that were, in practice, mixed. For every cart confiscated and vendor moved along, 3 more appeared around the corner. The tournament was too large, the demand too strong, and the sidewalks of 9 American cities too extensive to be comprehensively policed. The counterfeit economy of the 1994 World Cup was never formally quantified. It was, by all accounts, significant. The official merchandise operation was elaborate. FIFA had licensed the World Cup brand to manufacturers who produced the official range of tournament goods: jerseys, hats, scarves, pennants, keychains, plush mascots featuring Striker the World Cup pup, who was the tournament's official mascot and who managed to be simultaneously cheerful and slightly unsettling in the way of all major event mascots. The official goods were sold through authorised retailers, stadium concessions, and dedicated tournament merchandise stores that were set up near match venues in each host city. Prices were, by the standards of sports merchandising, substantial. An official replica jersey retailed for amounts that made casual purchase a considered decision for many of the international visitors whose currencies did not convert favourably against the dollar. The unofficial market provided a price point more accessible to the majority of fans. The quality of unofficial goods varied enormously, from reasonably well-made replica jerseys in the correct colours and approximate design to items that bore only a passing resemblance to the official merchandise and were held together with optimism and inadequate stitching. Experienced collectors of major event memorabilia learned quickly to assess the quality before purchasing. Less experienced buyers sometimes discovered, upon closer inspection in better light, that the official-looking jersey they had bought from a van outside Giant Stadium had a logo that was slightly the wrong shape and a fabric that was substantially the wrong texture. They wore it anyway. The emotional authenticity of a souvenir does not depend on its commercial legitimacy. The vendors themselves were drawn from the informal economic networks that exist in every major American city. People who understood how to set up, operate, and dismantle a mobile retail operation quickly, who had supply chains for counterfeit goods that were activated for major events and dormant between them, who knew which enforcement officers were likely to be strict and which could be managed with a combination of mobility and patience. Some were recent immigrants who had followed the tournament from their home countries and were supplementing the cost of their trip with entrepreneurial activity. Some were local operators who had done the same thing at the Super Bowl and the NBA Finals and understood the market precisely. All of them understood that the window was short, 6 weeks, specific match days, very defined locations, and operated accordingly, maximizing revenue for the duration, and then moving on to the next event, the next city, the next opportunity. FIFA's intellectual property enforcement budget for the 1994 World Cup was not small. It was also not sufficient. The informal economy is, in this respect, remarkably resilient. On the morning of July 18th, 1994, the day after the final, 9 American football stadiums woke up with a particular hangover of a venue that has just hosted a major event and must now reckon with what it has become. The temporary grass fields had to be removed. The temporary seating configurations had to be dismantled. The FIFA signage had to come down. The accreditation checkpoints had to be struck. The media centres had to be cleared. The 48 security cameras had to be retrieved. The event lighting, the public address upgrades, the communications infrastructure, all of it had been installed for a specific and now concluded purpose, and most of it now had to go away. Some of the permanent improvements remained and would serve the stadiums for years, but a remarkable proportion of the World Cup infrastructure was purely temporary, built for 6 weeks and then dismantled, leaving the stadiums roughly as they had been before, just slightly more expensive. The cost of removing the temporary installations added its own line to the final accounting, a fact that was buried in the budget documents, but was, for the people who understood it, somewhat clarifying. The decommissioning process began almost immediately after the final whistle. Event operations follow a rhythm of installation and removal that is as structured as the event itself, and the organisations responsible for the various components of the World Cup infrastructure had their removal schedules prepared in advance. The grass came out first at most venues, because natural turf that is no longer being maintained deteriorates quickly, and the stadiums needed their artificial surfaces back for the football seasons beginning in late summer. The removal of modular grass sections was the reverse of the installation. The sections were lifted, loaded onto flatbed trucks, and transported to sites where they were either replanted or composted depending on their condition. Most were composted. 6 weeks of match-day traffic had taken a toll that made reuse impractical. The media infrastructure came down in parallel. The communications cables that had been installed to serve the broadcast operations, the dedicated satellite uplinks, the additional power distribution systems that had been put in to support the expanded electrical loads of tournament broadcasting, all of it was removed, catalogued, and either returned to its vendors or written off against the tournament budget. The media centres themselves, temporary structures built to house thousands of journalists in conditions that met FIFA's accreditation standards were disassembled and removed. The spaces they had occupied returned to the parking lots and service areas they had previously been. Nothing remained but the concrete and the memories of people who had worked there. What stayed, in most cases, was the permanent infrastructure that had been justified as legacy improvements. The renovated locker rooms, the upgraded electrical systems, the improved drainage infrastructure, the expanded loading docks and service areas. These were real and durable additions to the stadiums, improvements that their operators would benefit from for years. They were also, in aggregate, a fraction of the total World Cup-related capital spending at those venues. The ratio between the permanent and the temporary, between the lasting and the discarded, was not something that featured prominently in the post-tournament communications from either the organising committee or the host cities. The permanent improvements were the part of the story that everyone wanted to tell. The temporary infrastructure, built at great expense, used for 6 weeks, and then removed, was the part that the accounting eventually forced a reckoning with, quietly and without ceremony, in budget documents that were filed and forgotten. The 2026 FIFA World Cup is scheduled to be hosted jointly by the United States, Canada and Mexico. The largest tournament in the history of the event, expanded to 48 teams and spread across 16 host cities. America agreed to host it, having had 32 years to study what went right in 1994 and what did not. The host cities have once again been presented with economic impact projections. They have once again received FIFA's list of requirements. The conversations about legacy, infrastructure, and the distribution of revenues are once again happening, in some cases with the same arguments, the same promises, and the same fundamental tension between what a global governing body wants and what a host city can actually afford. The lessons of 1994 are documented. The studies have been done. The budget overruns have been catalogued. Whether those lessons have been fully absorbed, or whether the same optimism that led 9 American cities to sign agreements in the late 1980s without reading the fine print will manifest again in 2026 is a question that accountants in 16 cities are currently in the process of answering, one invoice at a time. The bid for 2026 was submitted in 2018 and competed against a joint bid from Morocco, which had submitted and lost 4 previous World Cup bids with a consistency that suggested either extraordinary persistence or a fundamental misunderstanding of the FIFA voting process. The North American bid won decisively, and the announcement was received in the 3 host countries with a combination of genuine excitement and, among those who had been paying attention to the 1994 experience, a certain watchful caution. The excitement was real. The enthusiasm of a country that had watched MLS grow from a 10-team experiment into a continental institution, that had seen American players compete at the highest levels of European soccer, that had experienced the genuine cultural shift that 30 years of grassroots development had produced. That enthusiasm had a foundation in 1994 that had not existed before. The caution was also real, and it came from the same foundation. The 2026 tournament is, by every structural measure, larger than 1994. 48 teams instead of 32. 16 host cities across 3 countries instead of 9 in 1. More matches, more infrastructure requirements, more FIFA demands, more economic impact projections. The projections produced for 2026 are, naturally, even larger than those produced for 1994. Each subsequent generation of major event projections builds on the previous generation's methodology, adjusting for inflation and expanding for scale, without necessarily correcting for the systematic optimism bias that made the 1994 projections unreliable. Several economists who specialize in major event economics have published analyses of the 2026 projections applying the same critical framework they applied to 1994. Their conclusions are broadly consistent with what those frameworks have produced for every major sporting event in the intervening 3 decades. The projections are too high. The costs will exceed budgets. The locally retained revenues will be smaller than forecast. Some of the legacy investments will deliver real value. Others will not. The cities will pay. The tournament will happen. The soccer will be real. What is genuinely different about 2026 is the context of American soccer. The country that hosts the next World Cup is not the same country that hosted the last one. MLS is established. The women's national team has won multiple World Cups and generated a following that transcends the sport's previous demographic boundaries. American players are regular starters at elite European clubs. Youth soccer participation is among the highest of any sport in the country. The audience that 1994 had to discover and partially invent already exists and is considerably larger than anyone predicted it would become. Whether that audience translates into the kind of financial returns that justify the hosting costs is still an open question. The same open question asked 30 years later by a country that has learned a great deal from the first time it said yes and is about to find out how much of that learning it actually retained. So here you are. You made it through the whole thing, the stadiums that weren't built for soccer, the grass that was never meant to survive a Texas summer, the invoices that kept growing in the background like a very polite financial disaster, and the city officials who signed agreements they didn't fully read and then spent years explaining why it had all been worth it anyway. And in a way, it was worth it. Not in the way the brochures promised, not in the clean cascade of hotel revenues and neighbourhood revitalisation and economic multipliers that the consultants had assembled into such convincing documents in the late 1980s. Not in the way the projections said, because the projections were wrong in the particular way that projections about major events are almost always wrong. Optimistic at the top, quiet about the complications, and completely silent about what happens the morning after the last match, when everyone goes home and the grass starts dying and the invoice arrives. But worth it in the way that things which are bigger than their budget tend to be. Worth it in the way Andrés Escobar played, with everything he had, in conditions that carried risks most of us will never understand. Worth it in the way the volunteers showed up, tens of thousands of them, to hand a stranger directions in their own language in a city that didn't expect to know how. Worth it in the way a country that had spent decades being told it would never care about soccer found itself, for a few weeks in the summer of 1994, genuinely, unexpectedly moved. The financial architecture was imperfect. The scheduling was cruel. The grass in Dallas tried its best and suffered for it. FIFA got most of the money. The organising committee executives got a great deal of the rest. The cities got the bills and the infrastructure improvements and the complicated feelings of people who threw an enormous party, mostly for someone else, and are still not entirely sure how to feel about it. But the kids who watch those matches are in their 30s and 40s now. Some of them play in MLS. Some of them coach youth teams on Saturday mornings, passing the sport to children who have never known an America without professional soccer, who cannot imagine a World Cup being a novelty, who will watch the 2026 tournament and have no idea that 30 years ago the country hosting it had to be briefed on the offside rule. That is the legacy that doesn't fit in a budget document. The one that moved quietly through a generation, through parks and school fields and living rooms where the television was on, and a child was watching something for the first time and didn't know yet that it would matter. History doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives as a noon kickoff in 98-degree heat, imperfect and overpriced and slightly disorganized, and somehow, stubbornly, it takes root anyway. So tonight, as you drift off in your climate-controlled room with your reliable plumbing and your reasonably priced soft drinks that nobody's making you cover with a tarpaulin. Maybe spare a quiet thought for the groundskeeping crews who watered emergency grass at 3 in the morning, for the volunteers who drove strangers to the right stadium and asked for nothing in return, and for the players who ran 12 kilometres in Texas in July because the tournament said they had to, and the television schedule said it had to be noon. They didn't always get the credit. The accounting wasn't always fair. The promises weren't always kept. But the game was real, and somewhere in the stands a child was watching. Sleep well.